The scripture reading this evening will be taken from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 27 through 29. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world and the things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and the things which are not, to bring to naught things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence.
See, I learned my lesson tonight. When they say the sermon's next, that really doesn't mean the sermon's next. There's a Bible reading first, so I stayed played. Good to see everybody this evening. Take out your Bibles and turn to 1 Kings chapter 17. We're going to be looking at that in just a moment. Let me reiterate what Jeff said just a moment ago. It was great for us to be together this afternoon. Many, if not most of you, were there, and it was great to get to know each other and enjoy the company of those who are like-minded. And let me just say this. Every gospel meeting we go to, there is a potluck. Just about everyone. I think everyone. I'm not exaggerating when I say that was the best potluck I think I've ever had. I think every potluck should have a smoked meat competition. I had my plate full and I hadn't even got to the side dishes yet this afternoon. So that was great. I enjoyed that very much. Not just the food. I enjoyed the people more. So it was just wonderful. And I thank you all for doing that. Thank you for providing that. The Lucases providing that for us this afternoon. And it's just great to be together. And we look forward to the rest of this week as well. We're going to be looking again at Elijah this evening, as we're going to be doing all week long. We started that this morning, and we're going to continue exactly where we left off. But let me start by telling you the story of a man who was walking across the road when he was hit by a car. And the impact was so bad that it knocked him out into a coma for a couple of days. And he was out there before he finally regained consciousness. When he opened his eyes, he saw his loving wife there beside the bed, holding his hand. And he said, "You know, Judy, you have always been beside me, always by my side. When I was struggling in college and I failed again and again, you were always there for me. And when I got out of college and I went for my first interview, I failed to get jobs, one right after another, but yet you stayed with me. And then I started to work for this little firm, and I finally got the chance to have the big contract. I made one little mistake and I ruined everything. But all through that, you were there beside me, by my side." And he said, "Now I've been in this accident and I wake up and you are the first person that I see. There's something that I want to say to you. Judy, I think you're just bad luck." And I can't help but wonder if there are times when we treat God that way. Every time something bad happens in our lives as Christians, we have to understand that God is right there beside us and that he is holding our hands. He is holding us up. He's getting us through the rough spots. He has given us strength. He has given us something to hold on. He's given us hope. But instead of appreciating it, sometimes we tend to blame God for the bad things that happen in our lives. And there's a woman here in 1 Kings chapter 17, I think, who does exactly that. And Elijah is right by her side. He's taking care of her and he's taking care of her son. But then one day tragedy happens and everything changes. Well, tonight I want us to look at that story. And what I want to see is the lessons I think that are involved there for us this evening. But first, what I want us to do is go back and review just a little bit about what we studied this morning for those maybe who weren't with us, or just simply to remind us and set the stage for what's going on this evening. Elijah is the prophet of God that God sends to King Ahab, king over Israel, in order to tell him that he's going to be punished for his great wickedness. There were several wicked kings before him, but what we learn in chapter 16 is that he was the worst of all these. It just seems like the kings, the leader of the nations, they just seem to get worse and worse. Does that not remind you of something in our own country even? And through the influence of Ahab and his wicked wife Jezebel, Israel had started worshiping Baal and Asherah, who were the foreign gods of the Sidonians. And so as a punishment, God said he's going to make it stop raining. which is exactly what happened. For 3.5 years, it did not rain on the whole nation of Israel. It's hard to imagine how terrible that was. You and I, in our lifetimes, we have seen some pretty bad droughts, but never anything like this. Imagine what it would have been like to have no rain, no moisture, no dew at all for 3.5 years. After a couple of months, King Ahab probably made a decree and he said, all right, anyone who's caught water in their yards or washing their chariots are going to be fined accordingly. And after a few more months, nobody's allowed to wash their clothes or take a bath. And after 3 years, he doesn't have to say anything because there is no water, not even to drink. So remember that Ahab and Jezebel didn't take too kindly to his words. And as months went on without this rain, they are sending search parties out looking for Elijah, seeking to put him to death. But God protected Elijah. You remember, by hiding him at the brook of Kerith, feeding him with bread that was brought to him by ravens. And this morning, we learned the importance of trusting in God. That God, as we are faithful to him, he will always be faithful to us, that God will take care of you. He will provide those things that we need. But we also learned that God may not always take care of us the way that we want him to take care of us, or the way that we think that we ought to be taken care of. And what we're going to see tonight is exactly what God does that again. There wasn't much at the brook Kerith, and after months and months of no rain, you'll remember at the end of the lesson this morning, we looked at verse 7 that said that even the brook was drying up. And so Elijah had to go somewhere else. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah in verse 8, and it told him, saying, arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and stay there. Now, this must have sounded like one of those good news, bad news jokes. You know, the ones I'm talking about. The good news is this, but the bad news is that. The good news, Elijah, you finally get to leave Kerith. You've been out here alone by yourself with just ravens. You're ready to move on. The bad news is I want you to go to Zarephath. I don't know if Elijah knew much about geography there. It's possible that he had never heard of Zarephath before. It was a small town along the Mediterranean Sea on a coastland there of Phoenicia. So this is a Gentile Canaanite area that he's actually told to. It was basically an outlying city of Sidon, as we read here in verse 9. Elijah may not have heard of Zarephath before, but you can be certain that he had heard of Sidon. It's a larger town. But also what you'll remember that we studied this morning from chapter 16, that was Jezebel's hometown. That's where her father, King Ethbaal, is king of the Sidonians. So it is the very center of Baal worship. It is the center of Asherah worship. So why in the world would God send Elijah to a suburb of the city of Sidon? I mean, it doesn't make sense from a human standpoint, does it? Lord, no doubt Elijah was tempted to ask, Lord, do you not know what you're doing here? That Jezebel has my, she has my number, that she is looking for my scalp. Why in the world are you sending me into the shadow of her hometown? The brook Kerith, it certainly wasn't the Hilton, but it was a good hiding place. And Elijah probably knew every square inch of that particular area. Remember, he's probably from this area in the land of Gilead there. So if Ahab is chasing him and he gets close, Elijah could just sneak back in some cave somewhere, some ravine, somewhere that he knows. He could get away because he knew it very well. But Zarephath? He would be a stranger in a town where everybody in the small town knows that he's not from around here. And if he introduced himself, certainly he is in danger of being arrested. There could be relatives of Jezebel living in Zarephath, if not in Zarephath, certainly nearby in Sidon. And so all he knew was, he doesn't know anything about Zarephath, but he knows this is God's command, that I want you to go to Zarephath. But then that's not all that the Lord says. Here at the end of verse 9, after he says, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and stay there, he then says, I commanded a widow to provide for you there. Now, the word command, we should not get the wrong idea here. The word command doesn't mean I've told that widow to take care of you. Instead, the word command here means the idea of I've appointed her. In other words, I've set this in order. And so I want you to go to Zarephath, Elijah. And by the way, Elijah, I've arranged room and board for you when you get there. All your accommodations are set. And I picked out a poor woman who's about to starve to death to take care of you. She will take care of you. And if Zarephath didn't make any sense, I'm sure that made even less sense. But as Paul said in what we just read a moment ago in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 27, God doesn't always do things the way that we think that they should be done. In fact, he says in verse 27, God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. There are some things that we as humans think is foolish. It doesn't make sense to us, but God uses them sometimes to shame us, to make us think as mankind in general, that God is so much wiser than we are. He has chosen the weak things of the world to shame those things which we consider as strong. And the base things of the world and the despised, those are the things that God has chosen, whether that be people, which is the context of chapter 1, or things or ways that God does it, the things that are not, so that he may nullify the things that are. God does things differently than the way that we would choose to do them to prove that he is God. And here's the reason why he does that, so that no man may boast before God. God never wants us to forget in any situation in this life that he is the one to take care of us. And that's such an important lesson, especially for those of us in our culture who pride ourselves on our ability to take care of ourselves. I know, in thinking in America, the American spirit that we have developed, at least in the past, maybe not so much in the generation now, but it is a spirit of independence, one of I can take care of myself. And there's something to be said about that, not dependent upon other people, not entitlement. We understand that. But it also breeds this idea that I can overcome any situation on my own. And I don't need someone who is bigger than me to get out of this situation. And I think even within the church, I think many times we don't like turning to anyone else for help. What a shame, brethren, that is at times. I don't know why that is the case. That maybe we're afraid of being vulnerable to each other. And yet, Galatians chapter 6 tells us that we must bear one another's burdens. How can I bear your burden? How can you bear my burden if you don't know my burden? And so what that allows me to do, what it should cause me to do, is to bear my burden, become more vulnerable. We sometimes are afraid to do that. And the reason is because it looks like these brethren over here, well, they have their life in order. Everything in their life looks great. Everything, their children are all faithful. They've never had anything that goes wrong in their life. And that's not my life. I look at my life and my life. Yes, it looks good here on Sundays, but it's fallen apart. And so why, if I go to them, how would they ever relate with me? I think there's a disservice sometimes that we do when we make ourselves to look better than maybe we are. And I don't mean that we're trying to be fake. I'm not suggesting that at all or hypocritical. But sometimes we need to let others know that we're real, that we're just like you are, and you're just like I am, and that we all struggle with the same things. Because I guarantee if there's something that you struggle with, if there's some problem in your life, there is someone in this room who has gone through that or is going through that. And we need to reach out to one another. And the rest of us, we need to be reachable. We need to be approachable. That's what we're here for. God, in his eternal wisdom, has given us each other to build upon, to help each other through this life. We cannot do it alone. But the problem is we don't like to be dependent upon other people. Now, I can take care of myself, and I can provide for myself. But what God says to Elijah here is, don't ever forget that I am the one who takes care of you. And so Elijah does exactly what God tells him to do. In verse 10, he arose and he went to Zarephath. Now, this would have been a trip of 100 miles, as the raven flies. And he would have had plenty of time as he's traveling along that he would see the results of this drought as he's going along. And no doubt as he's traveling to Zarephath, passing through Israel, he could have said, well, God couldn't have gone to that place. I mean, that looks like a good place to stay. Or maybe over here, this looks good. Maybe they still have a little bit of water yet. So he's going through there and realizing he's passing up any of these places that he may have seen that he would have preferred to go to all along if it was up to him. But instead, in the wisdom of God and in his obedience, he travels to where he knows this widow is in this foreign town of Zarephath, to this Gentile woman. Now, Jesus himself mentioned this when he is talking to the synagogue in Nazareth in Luke chapter 4. And you remember he stands up before the synagogue and he begins to read. And then he says, I say to you in truth that there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the sky was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, when a great famine came over all the land. That's exactly the time we're talking about here. And yet Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath, the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And he goes on to talk about Elisha as well in this situation. But it's interesting that he preaches that. Now, as we look at him preaching that, look at the result of when he preaches this. In verse 28, all the people in the synagogue were filled with rage when they heard these things. And they got up and they drove him out of the city and led him to the brow of the hill on which their city had been built in order to throw him down over the cliff. Now, that seems like a mighty strong reaction to a sermon on Elijah and a widow. I hope there's no reactions like that this evening. Nobody wants to take the preacher out to the brow of Barnesville and throw him over the cliff. Let's not do that. But why would a simple story about Elijah stir up so much animosity from Jesus' neighbors, from the very people that he grew up with? Because what Jesus was really saying here was that God sometimes found greater faith among the heathen Gentiles than he found among his own people. And that was an insult to these Jews who considered the Gentiles to be nothing more than fuel for the fires of hell. Remember how upset that Jonah was when he was told that he needed to go preach to that Gentile city of Nineveh? I mean, he goes the opposite way to Joppa, intending to go to Tarshish as far away from Nineveh as he possibly can. So how do you think Elijah must have felt? Now he's got to go to this Gentile, this resident of a pagan town. And not just any Gentile, but a woman. And not just any woman, but a widow. And not just any widow, but a destitute widow who's starving to death. And as Elijah approached these city gates, he found this woman, and she is gathering some sticks in order to cook some food. It says he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city of Zarephath, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and he says, please get me a little water in a jar that I may drink. And as she was going to get it, he called to her and says, please bring me a piece of bread in your hand. So he comes to the gates of the city and she's gathering up these sticks to make a fire in order to cook some bread. And as he sees her there, he says, can you please get me a drink of water? Now, she doesn't respond in any way. Without words, I picture her turning around and going to do what she's asked to do, a good-hearted woman who wants to help out. But as she turns to do that, you have Elijah that said, oh, and by the way, while you're at it, could you also get me a piece of bread to eat as well? And evidently, she's already starving because this is going to be her last meal, as she sees it, in her house that she is preparing for her and her son to eat, and then they're going to die. So how is this better than the brook of Kerith? How is Elijah any better off? Elijah travels all of this distance and nothing seems to be better. In fact, it may even be worse because now there's no ravens bringing food for Elijah. But that's the way that it often is, isn't it? I think sometimes you say to yourself, my job stinks. And me and my boss, he's hard to work with. So I'm going to go get a new job. And lo and behold, you get to your new job and your new boss is twice as bad as your old boss. Nothing's changed. Or you say to yourself, I'm sick of living in this house. There's so many repairs that I'm always having to make. I'm going to buy a new house. So what do? You go and you buy a new house and the first time it rains, it's leaking, right? Nothing's changed. I've seen Christians who have changed congregations. They've left congregations where they're at and they go to other congregations because that church has problems. But guess what? When they get to the new congregation, they only find out that it has problems as well, and that people aren't acting the way they should at the new congregation. In fact, the problem was probably them. Nothing has changed. We often think, if I could just change my circumstances, that things would be better. We have this grass is greener syndrome many times, that it's always better on the other side. Don't count on it. Be content with where you are. Or as the modern statement goes, bloom where you're planted. Now, change isn't bad. And obviously this change was commanded by God. God told him to change. And there are some times that we need to make a change. Sometimes we need to get a new job. Sometimes we need to buy a new house. Sometimes we do need, rarely, but sometimes we need to find a new congregation. but change doesn't always improve our outward circumstances. And I think that's what Elijah is now learning. And that's what we should learn as well. Change doesn't always improve our situation. So here's Elijah talking to this starving widow now. And by the way, she's evidently a young woman. I think you can assume she only has one child, and that child is young, probably wasn't born not too long ago, which means that she would have had to have this child, not too long before her husband passed away. And so from all we can tell, she doesn't seem to have any family. None of them is mentioned there that can help her take care of her and her child. Her food had dwindled, just like the brook at Kerith that we studied about this morning had dwindled. And all she had now was left was this flour and a little bit of oil, enough to make basically 2 pancakes for her and her son, and they would eat them and then they would die. That's her plan. That's her outlook on life right now. But Elijah says something to her that as you read this, it almost seems cruel. She turns to Elijah and says, as Yahweh your God lives. Now, listen to that. She is a woman outside of Israel. She is a Gentile. So when she refers to Yahweh, this is Elijah's God. This is not a God that she knows at all. And she swears, as your God lives, I have no bread, only a handful of flour in the bowl and a little oil in the jar. And behold, I'm gathering a few sticks so I can go and prepare for me and my son that we may eat it and that we're die. That's her plan. This is our last meal. Well, as I mentioned, Elijah, he says something here. He says to her, do not fear, go do as you have said, but make me a little bread cake from it first and bring it out to me. And afterwards, you may make one for yourself and your son. Imagine hearing that. Did you hear me? I said I only had enough bread for myself and my son. And you're saying first go and eat, make this bread for you. And then after that, we can eat. Take your very last bit of food, give it to me. This is what Elijah is saying. And then you can have what's left over. That almost seems cruel. But I want you to understand that Elijah is acting according to the word of God. Remember what verse 9 said? God told Elijah, arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and stay there. Behold, I have commanded, I've appointed, I've prepared a widow there to provide for you. Notice that God didn't say a widow's there and she's going to starve and you're going to starve with her. That's not what he said. God promised to meet Elijah's needs. And so that's why Elijah makes this request of this widow, because he's confident that God is going to meet not only his needs, but then also her needs as well. God is not going to allow her son, or Elijah to starve. And so Elijah made what appears to be a very harsh request, but it is one that is made in faith. And that would have taken faith, wouldn't it? How much faith would that have taken for Elijah to say, go make me something, when he doesn't see anything to be made with? But it was also one that would require faith from her, if you think about it. Verse 14, he explains to her, thus saith Yahweh, the God of Israel, the bowl of flour shall not be exhausted, nor shall the jar of oil be empty until the day that Yahweh sends rain on the face of the earth. You see, he says to her, listen, you're going to be provided for because my God, the one that you said is my God, is going to provide for you for the rest of this drought. Do you appreciate how much faith was required for this widow here to do exactly what Elijah was asking her to do? She had no reason to believe Elijah. He just shows up, this foreign man who claims that by his God, who from their perspective has not brought any rain for a while, has said to her, I'm going to take care of you. Do you appreciate how much faith was taken there? And honestly, I'm not sure what possessed her to believe Elijah, this foreigner here, making these promises. Why would she use up her last bit of food and give it to Elijah? Listen, it is hard to trust God when you only have a little bit. When I have a lot in my possession, I can give a lot to God. And if I have a lot in my possession, I can give a lot to other people who are in need of when I have surplus, when I have an abundance, and I'm not worried because I have a lot left over, right? I know that. I'll be fine and I can take care of myself. But at those times when you don't have much, it's tempting to think, well, if I do give to God first, or if I do help out my brother or even someone in the world who is in need, well, how in the world am I going to take care of myself? You see the problem with that thinking? The focus is on myself. How am I going to do that sort of thing? I've got to think about me first and think about what I can do for others and for God later. That's the mentality that we often get into. So I can imagine this widow is struggling with those same thoughts, but in the end, what she does is exactly what Elijah tells her to do. And she goes home, she scrapes the bottom of the barrel to get the last bit of flour out. And she turned over that jar of oil, and she got every last bit of that oil out of there, every drop that came out. And she began mixing that together. And she kneaded that bread, and she stoked a fire with those few sticks that she gathered at the gate. And she baked this bread over this fire. And she took it out of the oven. She brings it before Elijah, sets it before him for him to eat. And surprisingly, there's enough not only for him to eat, but also for her and her son. There's enough to go around. But here's the amazing thing. The next day, she did the exact same thing. She looked in that jar of flour and said, oh, I could have swore that yesterday I used up all that flour. And she looked in that jar of oil, and there's enough oil. In fact, there's the same amount of oil that there was the day before. And she thought she remembered using it all up, but there it was again. And so she uses it, makes another loaf of bread, and she feeds her son, and Elijah. And day after day, she continues to do the exact same thing. God is providing daily bread for them, just as he promised for those who are faithful for him. In fact, for months, Elijah and the widow were fed that way. Verse 15 says, so she went, she did according to the word of Elijah, and she and he and her household ate for many days. The bowl of flour was not exhausted, nor did the jar of oil become empty, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke through Elijah. And once again, Elijah learned that God has a marvelous way of taking care of us. Through this time of drought, when everyone else is struggling to get by, Elijah and this widow and her son have their needs met by God. It wasn't a feast, understand that. It wasn't steak and potatoes. We're talking about bread, but it was food, and God was providing for their needs. But as is so often is the case in our lives, before things got better, sometimes they get worse. And suddenly something happened that took both the widow and Elijah by surprise. And in verse 17 says, now it came about after these things that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became sick, and his sickness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. So there's this another crisis in this life of this widow. And as a result, there is a crisis in the life of Elijah, but obviously much more so in the life of this widow. And that's the way that it is, isn't it? That's the way that life seems to be. Just one crisis right after another. It seems like you just get things squared away when all of a sudden there are more bills. It seems like you just get one car running, the other one dies. You just get one doctor bill paid off, and all of a sudden someone else in the family gets sick. It never stops. And it just seems like there's one crisis after another. You've often heard it said, maybe you've said it yourself, when it rains, it pours. It just seems like there's one more thing in my life. And you're thinking to myself, I just can't handle this one more thing. And guess what happens? One more thing happens in your life. When trouble comes, many times it seems to come in floods. And sometimes the great crises in life come after some act of commitment. After you've determined to do God's will, you've just become a Christian, all of a sudden something bad happens and Satan's trying to tempt you. Why don't you go back to the way it was? Or maybe there's been some struggle in your life that you're trying to overcome, some sin, some temptation, and you finally find yourself overcoming this, and all of a sudden things go bad. There may be some area in your life where you're struggling to do what God has told you to do, and you give way to the Lord. You commit yourself to that. You commit yourself to obedience, and you're following after him, and you think everything's going to be fine now. But it's not. And you begin to wonder, what's going on here? I'm doing exactly what God has told me to do, and this is the result. Somewhere we've picked up the idea that doing God's will means that life will always go smoothly and that there'll never be hard times. There'll never be distressing circumstances. And that just simply is not true. And so Elijah and this mother are confronted with this great tragedy. And being human, they had to be thinking here, what's going on? I have done everything God has asked me to do. And this is the thanks that I get. As a mother, she loved this boy. I mean, as a mother, she nursed this boy. She rocked this infant in a chair when he's a baby. She remembered the good times with him as he grew up. But now this child that she loves so dearly is just gone. And I have to wonder if Elijah also is hurt. Not only is he hurting because he's sympathizing with this widow, but also no doubt over the last several months there in this drought, I mean, they've been dependent upon each other. He's gotten to have to know this little boy, love this boy, probably played with this boy, maybe even been a father figure to this little boy over the last several months, and this child has passed away. Death is always difficult to handle, but the death of a child is especially difficult, isn't it? And some of you here know that. You know, we don't like it, but we can accept it when someone in their 80s or their 90s pass away. But a child with his whole life ahead of him, that's tough to handle. And for this widow, it would have been even more traumatic, because what this meant is that she was doomed to loneliness for the rest of her life. In that day and age, you understand, she couldn't just go out and get a job. She was stuck to being a beggar because she had no one else. Her husband is gone. Her only hope of being taken care of in her old age, her child, is now gone as well. Her entire life is probably wrapped up in this child, and now he's gone. It meant a life of hopelessness. As long as she had the son, she knew that she'd be taken care of. When her son would grow up and get a job, he could look after them, provide for the two of them, but now he's dead. Someone whose child has died, they go through a series of characteristic reactions. And I want you to understand, not all bereaved parents, they don't always suffer in the same way. But according to experts, most of them will experience the following responses: shock, denial, depression, loneliness, tearfulness, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, feelings of guilt, anger and hostility, and a lack of energy. And this widow may have experienced many of these types of reactions, but I think it was her feelings of guilt and anger and hostility that especially stand out. I want you to notice how she responds to Elijah. She said to Elijah, "What do I have to do with you, O man of God? You have come to me, you have come to me rather, to bring my iniquity to remembrance and put my son to death." You know what she's saying here is, look, Elijah, this is all your fault. That none of this would have happened if you would have never shown up. Never mind the fact that if he would have never shown up, her and her son would have starved to death long ago. But it was Elijah's God who had preserved them for the last several months. Never mind that the flour and the oil had miraculously been replenished day after day. During times of crisis, we have a tendency not to think very clearly, right? When things are going wrong in our lives, we don't think about all the good things that God has done for us. He has abundantly done so many great things, so many more good things in our life than he has allowed bad things in our lives to happen. And yet all we focus in on are those bad things. And you would think that she would stop and turn to this prophet and said, you know, you helped me before. I need your help again. But instead of turning to him for help, she turned away from him. And really what she's doing is blaming him for her son's death. It seems to be a human characteristic that when we are in tragedy, when we're going through a difficult thing, what we tend to do is start blaming people. We blame our circumstances. If you wouldn't have done this, we would have never been in this situation. If this wouldn't have happened, this situation would have never happened. But I think there was something else that was bothering this widow of Zarephath. She says, "Have you come to me to bring my iniquity, my sin to remembrance?" So at first she blames Elijah, but in her deeper feeling of hostility, I think she's really blaming herself here in this situation. Are you reminding me of my sin that I've committed? Which of course makes us wonder, we're not told here, but what was it that bothered her so much? What is the guilt, the iniquity that's burning inside of her? Maybe it's her sin of idolatry. That she's starting to recognize this is the one true God and I've been worshiping other gods. Maybe that's the sin. Maybe it was immorality. Maybe it was a sense of guilt regarding her husband's death. If only she had done something different. Maybe it's not a real feeling or a real situation. Maybe it is something invented in her mind, but still feeling guilty that her husband died because of something she did or didn't do. We don't know. Her sin could have been enormous or it could have been an imagined one. It really doesn't matter. But what does matter is that her sense of guilt separated this woman, not only from God, but also from this man of God, Elijah. And perhaps this mother's emotional explosion, I think, uncovered some guilt feelings that she hadn't been able to admit up to this point. And this tragedy may have been the first step towards really getting her life back together. And isn't that what happens so many times? Sometimes it takes a tragedy in our life, a crisis in our life that helps us get back to where God would have us to be. And what God was trying to do here through this account is to bring Elijah and the widow to the end of themselves. This is another Kerith. He's cutting them down. Remember, that's what Kerith means. And it's only when we come to the end of ourselves and the end of our resources, when we use up our own reserve, when we come to realize that it's not just about me and me getting myself out of this, that we begin to recognize our great dependence upon the Lord. And sometimes the Lord has to take us there because it's the only way he can get our attention and to make us realize what he can do for us. What a sad story this is, isn't it? She lost her husband. There's this great famine. All of her neighbors are starving. She's now lost a son. She's at the end of her rope. This has to be the last straw for her. But then Elijah comes to her in verse 19, and he says to her, "Give me your son." Then he took him from her bosom. He carried him up to the upper room where he was living and laid him on his own bed. And so Elijah poured out all of his confusion that's in his heart. And in verse 20, he calls to Yahweh and he says, "Oh, Yahweh, my God." Remember what Elijah's name means. My God is Yahweh. "Oh, Yahweh, my God, have you also brought calamity to the widow with whom I'm staying by causing her son to die?" Maybe a better way of understanding this is, "Lord, why are you breaking this widow to pieces? She has been taking care of me. Don't do this to her. Why, God, are you allowing this to happen? Maybe me, God, hurt me, but this widow, why her? Why?" You know, the question of why plagues all of us humans when we go through difficult times. Not just Christians, but non-Christians and Christians. And you know, the Bible gives us many possibilities for suffering, why we suffer the way that we do. Maybe sometimes it's because we've sinned and God is allowing suffering to bring us back to him. Sometimes it's not that we've sinned, but maybe we can do better. And so God causes suffering to happen or allows suffering to happen so that we can be stronger. We can grow closer to God, more dependent upon him. Sometimes it's just a consequence of other people's sins, and we suffer because of what other people do. There's all kinds of reasons that are given in the scriptures about why we suffer the way that we do. But we need to be careful that we don't become so obsessed with the why that we neglect the who that is here. And I think that was the problem in the book of Job. All the book of Job, you have so many chapters. They're trying to figure out, why is this happening to Job? And his three friends are saying, well, it's because you've sinned. You must have sinned. Job keeps saying, no, I haven't sinned. I haven't sinned. They keep going back and forth. Just as because you sinned. This is why this is happening. You know what? You read the whole book of Job, and Job never finds out why this happens, because that's not the point of the book. It doesn't matter why all of this happens. It matters that God isn't the one in control. It's not the why that matters. It's the who. Because we're obsessed with finding out why so many times, we take our eyes off of what God is able to do with us and for us. And so verse 21 says that Elijah stretched out himself upon the child 3 times and he prayed to Yahweh. And once again, he says, "Oh, Yahweh, my God." Again, my God is Yahweh. "I pray you, let this child's life return to him." Do you see what he is praying for? This is an amazing thing. Don't let this slip by you, because he is praying that this boy's life would come back to him. He is praying for a resurrection. And we read this and we think, well, yeah, resurrections happened in the Bible. Not up to this point. No one's ever been resurrected before this point. So he is asking for something that he doesn't know humanly has ever existed. Now, we know from the book of Hebrews that Abraham thought, well, maybe God could resurrect this man, Isaac, but Isaac never died. Here, he's praying for something that has never happened. What great faith this would have been for Elijah to offer this tremendous prayer. And then verse 22 says, Yahweh heard the voice of Elijah. And let me stop there. How many times does it take in the Bible, somebody praying for something, and then God reacts right away? I have to wonder if sometimes God is just waiting for us to ask before he acts. We need to be praying to God, and God listens and God hears. Not always exactly the way we want it to be, but sometimes it's just a matter of us asking our Father and him wanting to hear that from us. Yahweh heard the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child returned to him, and he revived. Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room in the house and gave it to his mother. This boy was resurrected from the dead. And Elijah takes this boy up in his arms, and he descends down the stairs with this boy in his arms, and he gives it to the mother who is crying. Can you imagine that scene? Can you imagine yourself as a mother and your child has died and the things that are going through your mind about this? And all of a sudden, this man comes down the stairs with your child and he's alive again. And her tears would still be rolling down her cheeks, but now they turned into tears of joy. He gave him to his mother, and Elijah said, "See, your child is alive." Now notice the widow's response in verse 24. Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of Yahweh in your mouth is truth." You see, remember back in verse 12 when Elijah first entered Zarephath? The widow had identified this man of God. And remember, she said, "Yahweh, your God." But now she knew it from experience. Yahweh was now her God. When Elijah brought that son back to life, she had to acknowledge that Elijah's God is the only source of life. And if he's the source of life, what she also concludes at the end of verse 24 is you're the source of truth. You see that life and truth go together. And that's why Jesus says in John chapter 14, verse 6, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." If you can resurrect someone, if you can give life, then you have the truth. And that's exactly what Jesus shows on the cross. And 3 days later, when he's resurrected, proving that he not only can give life to us, but he is the source of all truth. Thus, we must turn to him. And so her statement is not simply that now she believed exactly what Elijah had been telling her was true, but rather that what he has been telling her was absolute truth, that all truth is found in Elijah's God, Yahweh. And so the mother's faith grew, and so must ours. And that's what going through these life experiences do for us. Here at Zarephath, Elijah learned another important lesson. You know, at the brook Kerith, as we learned this morning, Elijah learned God will take care of me. But at Zarephath, he learned God can use me to help take care of others. God's still doing it, but he's using a different instrument. Now, Elijah is ready to go and do some great things. And that's what we're going to be talking about the rest of the week. But I want you to understand what he did for this widow was now what he is supposed to go do to the rest of the country, to Israel, to teach them that in the one true God is where you find life, and that is where you find the truth. Well, here's the question that we all need to ask by way of application this evening. When life gets tough, who am I going to trust in? Where can I find my security? That when terrible things happen to me, am I willing to trust God that he's going to take care of me? Or am I only going to sleep well at night when I figured out a way to take care of it all by myself? Because that's our tendency. As long as we can see how things work out, as long as I have the answers, if I know what's going to happen in the future, I'm okay, right? I feel secure in that. As long as there is a plan, then I'm okay. And as long as everybody's following my plan, I'm okay. But you know what? That doesn't require any faith in God. We would love to have all the answers, wouldn't we? We would love to know how all of our children turn out. If they're faithful to God to the very end, we would love to know that, but we can't. And that's where it takes faith, isn't it? Brethren, it's not hard to praise God when you've got money in the bank and the boss just gave you a raise and your marriage is happy and your kids are doing fine and everything is going well at the local congregation. It's easy to praise God then, isn't it? But if all you have is a God of the good times, then you don't have the God of the Bible. You don't have Elijah's God, and you don't have faith that will help you during hard times. What are you going to do when the boss says you're fired? What are you going to do when you run out of money? When the doctor says, I'm sorry, it's cancer and there's nothing we can do about it. What are you going to do when your wife or husband of so many years says, I'm finished, I'm done, I'm gone? What are you going to do when your kids are struggling? Or what are you going to do like in this widow situation when your child dies? In those moments, you really find out what kind of faith you have. And God says, I want you to know if you trust me to get you through those moments, when you don't see any possible way out, when there doesn't seem like any human plan possible, everything's going to be okay. You know, we've all heard it said that when you get to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. But as Christians, we have more than just a rope. Because like Elijah, we worship a God that has shown time and time again his ability to take care of us regardless of what happens. A God who has demonstrated that through the power of resurrection. Not only of a young boy in Zarephath, but also of his own son who died and was raised on the third day. And because of that, we can have all the confidence in the world that we can fully commit ourselves to him. So the question is, who are you going to trust in tonight? Do you trust in Jesus, the one who died for you? Not only died, but was resurrected. And by being resurrected, prove that he has the power to give you life, not just physical life. He already gave you that. But he has the power to give you spiritual life, eternal life that begins right now. Will you take advantage of that, repenting of your sins, confessing your faith in Jesus, and being immersed in water this very evening to have your sins washed away? Then living a life that is faithful to God from here on out. Even when difficult times come, because difficult times are going to come, but who are you going to trust? Who are you going to continue to trust even in the bad times? Maybe you've sinned against God in some way. Maybe it's of a private nature. Make it right with God this very evening. If it's of a public nature, make it known to this congregation so they can be praying for you, so they can forgive you as well. But whatever your needs may be, if you have a burden that we need to bear, we want to bear that with you. Let us know that so that we can be praying for you. Whatever your need is this evening, why don't you come forward now as we stand and sing.